But is this just a story of brutal iron-fisted dictators? Or something inherent in the philosophy? The fathers of communism, Marx and Engels, believed that societies would evolve from capitalism to socialism. But they acknowledged that there were still what they called primitive societies that hadn't even evolved into capitalists yet. They called them racial trash. As the revolution happens, the classes and the races too weak to master the new conditions of life must give way. There was only one thing left for those too far behind in the process of societal evolution. The chief mission of all other races and peoples, large and small, is to perish in the revolutionary Holocaust. Up until the horrors of Hitler, prominent socialist supporters discussed these ideas out in the open. Nobel Prize winner, Fabian socialist, and prominent Soviet supporter, George Bernard Shaw.
I don't want to punish anybody, but there are an extraordinary number of people whom I want to kill. I think it would be a good thing to make everybody come before a properly appointed board, just as he might come before the income tax commissioners, and say every 5 years or every 7 years, just put him there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us and it can't be of very much use to yourself.
And this was actually somewhat subtle for Shaw. He'd also foreshadow some of the worst atrocities in our planet's history. He wrote, "I appeal to the chemists to discover a humane gas that will kill instantly and painlessly. In short, a gentlemanly gas, deadly by all means, but humane, not cruel."
People like George Bernard Shaw were convinced that overpopulation was this terrible, terrible problem, particularly because the unfit, the genetically less desirable, were swamping the good genetic types. In the late 19th century, there are almost the cream of British intelligentsia embracing eugenics well into the early 20th century, saying that thousands, millions had to be marched off into gas chambers and liquidated. George Bernard Shaw has this great line where he says, we should do it while playing lovely classical music as we march them into the gas chambers. The idea, a lot of people seem to think that this concept of the gas chamber as a tool of social policy was invented by the Nazis. It wasn't. It was, and I mean this in the most disgusting, evil way, it was perfected by the Nazis. But this idea of using things like gas chambers to kill off millions of people so that the rest of the good guys could prosper and move to the sunny uplands of history was immensely popular.
All of these systems are based on the idea that we know better. If the little people get in the way of our plan, well, first we'll go around them, and then we'll destroy them. This arrogance always ends exactly the same way. One of history's worst examples, the genocide you've never heard of. Next. The atrocities of Hitler are rightfully recognized as beyond abhorrent, but we must continue to be vigilant to make sure they never happen again. We must never forget, but we also must never stop learning. Here's another story of genocide that for some reason history has erased. Growing deep within the roots of socialism is a brutal and dismissive view of human life.
The essence of Marx is simply that the universe is run by these cold, material, impersonal forces, and that over time we are going to see us move from the feudal, through the capitalist, to the socialist, to the communist stage. Along the way, a lot of people are going to get killed, and Marx was completely fine with this.
In the Nazi Germany, these groups were of course defined by ethnicity, like the Jews, for example, and in the Soviet Union they defined them by social origin. but the idea was the same.
Communist chief and dictator of 160 million Russians.
Today, most have forgotten the scale of the Soviet atrocities, particularly what may have been their most horrific. It began long before Hitler's horror was revealed. Popular uprising had become a problem in the Ukraine. Their spirit of individualism threatened the grand design of Moscow. Stalin decided to take steps and correct the problem.
The objective was to put the Ukrainians on their knees.
Stalin forced peasants to give up their farms under the banner of collectivization.
And it is the peasants who are the army of nationalism. So what do? You got to crush them.
Наприклад, у моєї дружини дідусь, який у 33-му році помер, був арештований за те, що він не захотів йти в колгосп. Просидів у тюрмі. Поки він сидів у тюрмі, його дружину змусили, щоб вона написала документ про розлучення. Бо в тебе дід приходить з тюрми, в його нема дружини, вона відлучена. Немає можливості зустрітися з дітьми, в його нема хати, в його нема землі, в його нема нічого. Це таких історій мільйони.
Stalin took everything. Their independence, their livelihoods, and even their food, plunging the Ukraine into famine. And while the people were starving, it wasn't because the food wasn't growing. Grain production was skyrocketing. Instead of giving the grain to starving people, the Soviets exported it to fund their centrally planned industrialization. How the Soviets dealt with the hunger was inhuman.
Она заходит. А кто у вас здесь помер? Давай. Там до одной, значит, женщина сама лежит, опухшая, по-моему. Так, говорит, давай ее сейчас заберем. Что она все равно помрет завтра, за ней еще ехать нужно будет. Сегодня она просит, что да я же еще живу, я жить хочу, я...
Скинули з вода. Як стануть землею закопувати, то я мала не ходила на кладбище, а люди такі вже дорослі ходили. Коли земля ворушилася, як закриють цю землю.
The forced famine that resulted was so horrific, the situation so desperate, that there were even widespread reports of cannibalism.
I was once with a group of people going to one part of Ukraine, and I said, is there some older lady that could tell me something about what happened?
What the woman told him next, he would never forget.
And she said, oh my God, I really don't like to talk about that. She says, you see, there is this house on the top of the hill there. A mother ate her daughter. She was already insane, because people usually reach the level of insanity. And then she committed suicide.
How did the Soviets deal with this? They printed posters that said, "To eat your own children is a barbarian act." This period is known as the Holodomor, roughly translated as murder by hunger.
І помирати від голоду не було дуже рідким явищем там, в 19-му, повторюю, і 20-му столітті. Але є дві різниці. Смерть від голоду і вбивство голоду.